Casey. I'm the curator of the West Haven Veterans Museum, and I'm going to attempt to take you on a virtual tour of our facility. We have a timeline that begins with the Revolutionary War up until present, and I will have some museum associates help me out with this presentation who are experts in military history. So let's go inside and look at the area where it all begins. This is our gift shop where you can buy things, and these are all items that support the museum. We have our office where our president resides, and we figure out how we're going to run things and do things. This is our staging area where we bring groups in and we begin talking about what the museum is all about. We start with the Civil War. We have a picture of Walter Osborne, who was a member of the New Haven Greys. We have a picture of Blackjack Pershing, who was the commander of the AEF. And we also have a painting of John Machine Gun Parker, who provided the cover fire for Teddy Roosevelt going up San Juan in the Spanish-American War. This is the women's area where we have uniforms from different eras, various women. We have a Marine captain here. We have a woman that served in the OSS. She was actually from West Haven, lived about 2 miles away from the museum. Very interesting service. She traveled all over Europe with her husband, working behind the lines, helping to defeat the Germans. This woman right here actually served in the Air Force. She was a parachute rigger, and she made sure that the pilots and or paratroopers or whatever suits were well packed or packed appropriately. This woman here is a RAF flight nurse, World War II. Some more of Beatrice Stevenson Latham's items that go along with the OSS uniform are right here. Okay, not an original uniform. This is from the Landcrafter Fife and Drum Corps. We often talk about Benedict Arnold because he has ties to New Haven, and the famous Powder Day on April 22nd is commemorated every year. This is a uniform here that was worn in the movie The Patriot, very similar to what the colonials wore during that time period. We have various muskets that would have been used, tricorn hats. We actually have a Hessian sword, in this case right here, that was obtained in West Haven, so I believe it could possibly have belonged to a Hessian soldier that came through with General Garth on his way to New Haven. We also have another sword here made by Nathan Starr, who made swords for the colonials during the Revolutionary War. Okay.
Good morning. The museum follows a timeline, and where we are now is we're entering our Civil War gallery. I want to talk a little bit about the reasons why the war came about. Wars always happen for reasons. They just don't happen in a vacuum. And in the 77 years from the end of the American Revolution to the beginning of the Civil War, there are a number of compromises that were passed by Congress to address the issues of secession and also slavery. And these are the compromises that were enacted. But it really took the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, where the South finally decided to secede from the Union. And that was because Lincoln ran under the platform that slavery could stay where it was in the South, but could not expand. And why the South at that point felt it was important to succeed is that they knew that if they couldn't expand, because cotton takes up a lot of nourishment from the soil, they need more land. If they were just limited to where they were, the whole institution of slavery, the value of slaves would decrease, and slavery perhaps would no longer exist at that point. Now, the armies, both Union and Confederate, were strictly volunteers. the United States, after the American Revolution, they disbanded their army because the only example they knew was the European model, where if the armies got too strong, they would overthrow the government. So when the Civil War started, we had a few professional soldiers out in the frontier guarding our territorial borders, but it was strictly a war of volunteers. And it was also a war that women played a very important role. When the men went out to war, they actually filled all the roles that the men had in factories and farms. And one of the most important contributions that women made is most of them made cartridges, the ammunition that Civil War soldiers would use. Now, during colonial times, everyone's familiar with the powder horn. That's where you have powder, but you know, the marksmen had to be pretty accurate in knowing how much powder to put in. But during the Civil War, they actually made cartridges where they would roll the cartridge, put the mini ball, which is this projectile here, and then they would roll it again and put the correct amount of powder in, 60 grams of black powder in the cartridge, fold it, put it in packages, and each soldier received 40 rounds. The bullets themselves were out of lead, the mini ball. And basically carrying 40 cartridges was roughly 4.5 pounds that a soldier had to carry. Now this work was dangerous because any spark, there were instances where a lot of women did die because of explosions. So again, we owe a lot to the women, the North, in terms of winning the Civil War. And I just want to mention one thing about this particular projectile. It's a .58 caliber, and it's a very slow moving projectile. So when you see pictures of, you know, soldiers on the field that are dead, you see that their jackets are ripped open. It wasn't because soldiers went in to try to see what they had. They themselves wanted to know where they were hit, because this bullet moves so slowly it just explodes. And if you're hit in the stomach, they knew they were going to die because there was no way surgeons could repair that type of damage. It also caused soldiers to lose a lot of limbs, because once your bones were hit, it would shatter. And the only way they could save you perhaps was really by amputation. Now moving over here, this is a typical setup of what a Union soldier would have in terms of setting up for the night. They were issued a canteen, which was very important because you need to hydrate. I'm wearing a wool uniform. I always ask the school children to come, why do you think they wore wool uniforms? And everyone says, oh, because it's cold? And I would say, well, we're going to go down south. It's really hot down there. And the reason for wool is because it's a durable material. But it breathes, so it does, your perspiration and all does evaporate, but you need to hydrate yourself. They were issued this haversack where you put personal belongings in it. And what you would see here is what a typical soldier would have in terms of what he would have to carry. Each soldier had a wool blanket, but also he was issued a gum blanket. And back then, there was Armstrong rubber, and they vulcanized rubber. So the rubber side goes on the ground, so the moisture stays, and you put your wool blanket over it. 2 soldiers would sleep in this particular tent. This is what one soldier would have. In the back, in that black item there, is a knapsack, and basically a Civil War soldier carried 23 pounds in that knapsack, 4.5 pounds with the cartridges, and then a 10-pound musket. So you had to be pretty fit, and those soldiers walked during the Civil War. The other interesting thing is that each soldier was given half a tent. So you really needed to buddy up with someone in order to set this up. They would go out in the woods and they would cut out branches to form their tent and all. But during a battle, basically they didn't have this set up. They would just, anything, they would just wrap this around themselves and sleep wherever they were. Now moving on, this is a uniform of John Riggs, who served in the 7th Connecticut, out of Derby, Connecticut. And this is a perfect example of a frock coat. Now, I'm wearing a sack coat. The Civil War soldiers were issued 2 uniforms. This was a dress uniform. And you can see that by the number of buttons in terms of how you would prepare yourself. I'm wearing a sack coat that has 4 buttons. So when the call comes to fall in line, it's much easier to put this jacket on than it is for this one here. And this is a rare instance of having a frock coat that still exists in this condition and all. Now, moving on into the gallery itself, the Union and Confederate armies were divided into 3 branches. And the first branch we see here with the swords that are displayed, we see swords that are straight and some that are curved. And again, I'll ask some of the astute kids when they come in, what type of sword do you think a cavalryman would use? And most of them would say the straight sword. And then I would say, well, does it make any sense to you if you're standing or sitting on a horse? Can you really pull, are your arms long enough to pull the sword up? And then they would have this look on their face, and I said, no, it's the curved sword, because a cavalryman sweeps the sword out of the scabbard and all. And during the Civil War, the cavalry basically served as scouts. Unlike previous wars, men on horses, that really was a formidable offensive weapon that they had. But during the Civil War, the advancement in arms and all made that cavalry division, not used as an offensive weapon. Moving on, in this display cabinet, we have the artillery. And most people think that when they talk about artillery, we're always talking about these round projectiles, the cannonball, solid shot. And they were used during the Civil War, but you would use something like this to knock down fortifications. The other type of projectile which served all artillery men during that particular war are these shells, the ones that look like little torpedoes. And then on top of it, you see a hole. And what they would do is an artilleryman would put a fuse in it. And if you knew an army was advancing on you, say 500 yards away, they would cut the length of the fuse, light it, shoot it out of the cannon, and that fuse would then burn down 500 yards away and then explode over the heads of the advancing soldiers. They didn't have metal helmets. In fact, all they had was really cardboard and leather for their hats. And in this display cabinet, you can see fragments of those shells that would explode over the soldiers' heads and all. And then if they got really close enough, this particular projectile is called a canister. Basically, it reminds you of a big shotgun shell. You can see all the little balls in there. So if the army got that close to you, they would double load their cannons and fire canisters. And then that would go boom, and those balls would fly all over. So the artillery really served an important role in terms of, basically beating down an advancing army. And then when we get into the infantry, the big advancement during the Civil War was that the muskets that they had were rifled, meaning that there were grooves in the barrel. Unlike the rifles that they used during the American Revolution, which was a hollow tube, the round ball would bounce around. So even if I was aiming straight at a target, I wouldn't know if that projectile would go left or right. But with the rifled barrel and with the mini ball that had grooves in it, that would follow the track of the barrel, and the projectile would go straight. And the range of a Civil War musket was 300 yards, the equivalent of 3 football fields. Whereas the American Revolution, you were lucky to hit a target 60 yards away. So the perfect example of how they would fight was Pickett's Charge. They had over 13,000 Confederates advancing on the Union forces. the artillery would soften them up by exploding these projectiles over their heads. And as they got closer, within 300 yards or so, then the infantry would fire. And then if they got beyond that, if they got close enough, then they would fire these canisters and all. So the Civil War, the armaments was more advanced than the techniques that they had. And they finally decided, after the Battle of Cold Harbor, where in 30 minutes, 7,000 Union soldiers were killed, advancing on fortified trenches that the Confederates had dug. Grant said it was the worst mistake he made during the war. And from that point on, it was trench warfare as opposed to offensive assaults on the position. And that technique went into World War I. As you know, there was much more trench warfare during World War I than there was offensive assaults. Now, coming through, looking at the various different items that we have, most of the artifacts that we have are donations by people. And we were fortunate that we got a call that someone wanted to donate some artifacts to the museum. And our curator, Ed Casey, went out to the house, and when he pulled up to the house, he sort of looked at it in wonderment. Am I at the right place? Because the place was deserted, it was in such a state of disrepair, it was ready actually to be demolished. And then when Ed went into the museum, up into the attic area, lo and behold, it was just a treasure that opened up, because all the artifacts there came from the Admiral Foot Camp number 17 of the Sons of Veterans of New Haven, a Grand Army of the Republic association that veterans joined after the war. 5 presidents served in the Civil War, and they were elected because of the veterans who made up such a big political affiliation to do that. And what we found here were, ribbons, badges of different reunions that the members went to. But probably the most important artifact, and one of the most important artifacts that we have in the museum, is this autograph book that we have here. And the autograph book was signed by people who came out for the celebration of the dedication of the Soldier and Sailors Monument in East Rock Park. And that was during the time when many of the Union generals were still alive. In fact, we made a copy of that particular autograph book, and lo and behold, there's William Sherman, Joseph Hawley, we have F.D. Grant, who is the son of Ulysses Grant. We have William Sherman in this also. So again, many famous people came to New Haven for that particular dedication and all. Now, as we come to this display, I asked the little kids, well, how do you think they communicated on a Civil War battlefield? And they would say, well, did they have walkie-talkies? Did they use phones and all? And I would always remind them that that era was before all this modern communications. The 2 ways that they communicated was by flags. The tallest person became the flag bearer, and the commanding officer would say, run 50 paces to my right. He would do so, plant the flag, and then the company would follow him, knowing where the commanding officer wanted them to be on the field. And because you were the flag bearer and the tallest one, you were the target. So you were always the one they would be firing at you, because once that flag drops and all that smoke and chaos, people would not know where to be on the battlefield. But that flag never dropped, because they were taught that if it starts falling, you drop your musket, you pick up the flag, and you reestablish the position. The other important instrument that they used to communicate were drums. The drummer boys would learn how to play certain beats: advance, retreat, ready, aim, shoot. And these are samples of 2 drums. What's interesting is that there's a hole in the side of the drum here. And it has really a purpose of, when you hit the drum head, you create a lot of vibration, so you don't want to shatter it. So that lets out the forces when you beat on the drum head. But also, if you pick up that drum, hold it up in the light, you'll be able to see the name of the maker of that drum, and also perhaps the company. And we are very fortunate to have a drum that was made by Eli Brown that goes all the way back to 1823. Now we're entering into the New Haven Grace room. This room is a replica of the New Haven Grace room, which was located in the New Haven Armory on Gulf Street. The state, in all its wisdom, decided to sell the armory, and we were able and given permission to try to take out as much of the New Haven Grace room as we possibly could. All the fixtures, the doors, the woodwork, the artifacts that are in here came from the Grace room. That room was much larger, but I think it gives you a great sense of what that room was like. Now, the New Haven Grays were established in 1816 by members of the Second Company of the Connecticut Foot Guard. And this was the pre-runner of what became our National Guard and all. The uniforms are patterned after West Point cadet uniforms, and you can see NHG, New Haven Grays. The artifacts that you see in this particular room, the trophies and all, they competed against other units, and these were some of the things that they won. Members of the New Haven Grays participated in the Civil War, and this particular marble monument lists the members and the different regiments that the members of the Grays fought in. The other two items, which is somewhat unique that we have in here, is that we have displays on two Chinese soldiers that fought for Connecticut regiments. I portrayed Corporal Joseph Pierce at reenactments and living histories. And we have a mannequin here of Joseph Pierce. He was the highest ranked Chinese soldier during the Civil War, brought back by a sea captain by the name of Amos Peck, from a prominent family in Berlin, Connecticut. In fact, the library, the Peck Berlin Library, is named after the family and all. So I'm very fortunate when I reenact that I actually get to portray a soldier that fought in the Civil War. Not to promote myself, but I did write a book about Joseph Pierce. It's called An American Journey. And it talks about how he came from China, fought in the Civil War, and then really became part of the American dream in terms of being able to marry, have a profession as an engraver and all. The other artifact that we have here is the knapsack of Antonio Dardell, who was in Company A of the 27th Regiment. That was a 90-day regiment. And this particular knapsack was given to all the members of Company A by people, citizens in the city of New Haven. Now, this particular knapsack is somewhat unique because it's a rectangular frame. It had little compartments where you can put things in it. Probably very well crafted, but not very practical. You can't really get a lot of items in there. The regular Union Army gave you a knapsack that basically maybe resembled a backpack where you could put a lot of different things in it. But what's unique about this is the only surviving example of this particular item. During the Battle of Chancellorsville, just before Gettysburg, the entire Company A was captured by the Confederates. So in order not to give the Confederates anything they used, they basically burnt all their knapsacks. Dardell's knapsack is the only one that survives, and we're very fortunate to have that. And moving on through the Grace room, you can see the various people that were part of the New Haven Grays and all. Now this is a really fun item that we have here. It's a table, the Grays tabletop. And I'll talk a little bit about this Now the New Haven Grays, they were also part of the group that went down to chase Pancho Villa back along the border when Villa was conducting raids into Texas and all. And when they did their training, afterwards they would always go to this canteen for refreshments and all. And one day the members of the Grays, they got there late and they saw other soldiers sitting in the area that they normally would go to. And they asked those soldiers to get out, get away from their table. And they responded by saying, well, how do we know it's your table? There's no names on it. Well, after those soldiers left, what they did, the members of the group carved their initials right into that table. So they could say, if they came and there was someone sitting there, get away from our table. My name is here. So we were very fortunate to get this as a relic for our collections and all. So I'm very happy that you've had the opportunity to come and see this short tour of the Civil War Gallery in the New Haven Grays room. But I invite all of you to come to the museum. There's free admission and all. And I think that we have one of the most unique military museums in the state. And thank you.
Okay, this is the World War I section of the museum. And in 1916, elements of the 1st and 2nd Connecticut went down to Nogales, Arizona, to chase Pancho Villa and hopefully catch him. Well, they weren't successful in that, but they learned valuable techniques that will help them in the trenches in Europe a year later. So, summer of 1917, the 1st and 2nd came back to Connecticut, and they were formed into what is known nowadays as the 102nd Infantry Regiment, which we represent. We have a lot of artifacts. We have a medal, a Distinguished Service Medal, an award given to Harold Brown, who was one of the most highest decorated veterans of World War I from Orange. We have a battle map of Sespre, which was a battle in which the 102nd fought in. We have a painting, which was done in 1927, of the Battle of Sespre. And it started whereas the cook was alerted that the Germans were coming into town, and he went after one of the Germans with a meat cleaver, of all things, and then alerted the regiment, and they pushed the Germans out of the town. So this is a nice painting depicting that action, that battle, and you can see the cook right here going after the German. Other things we have on display, a lot of painted helmets. In World War I, especially in the Yankee Division, each unit had a painted helmet insignia on the front. We have more World War I items, uniforms. This right here is a roster of the Yankee Division Veterans Association from New Haven. All the veterans that participated in World War I in the Yankee Division from New Haven are on this list. We have more World War I uniforms, mess kits, a nice bronze of Machine Gun Parker. Come over here. We thought it was important to do mannequins on all the infantry regiments from this area that fought in World War I in 26th Division. We have the 101st, which is from Massachusetts National Guard, the 102nd, which was the Connecticut National Guard. We have the 103rd, which is a general New Hampshire, Maine unit. And then we have the 104th, which was units from all around New England. And if you look here, we have a variety of World War I uniforms. We have a French 75mm cannon that was given to Yale to train our troops before World War I. We have a variety of different types of landmines and World War I helmets. We have trench heart over here, which quite commonly you find this stuff. Our soldiers in 1919, when the war was over, had a lot of time on their hands, and they had a lot of piles and piles of shells. So you commonly find these in pairs, and they're decorated. They etch images and scenes on them, flowers and different types of things. So this is something that's found very commonly from World War I. We also have a nice diorama, which was done by a gentleman a few years ago, and it shows the 102nd fighting the Germans. And one of the things that we do with people that come through is we actually have them find the stubbies, and there's about 6 stubbies in here that you have to find. In this area we have a few more World War I items. We have a German uniform, a Marine uniform here. Okay.
Hi, my name is Frank Chasney. I'm the president of the West Haven Museum, Military Museum and Learning Center. We're going to start you on the Second World War. This would be a bomber jacket. It's in very good shape. It belonged to this gentleman here, so I understand. His plane was shot down. He parachuted out, saved his parachute, and when he was married, his wife made her wedding dress out of it. It's one of the more unique items in this museum. So we're going to move on to Stubby, which is the most famous war dog in the world. This is how he is in the Smithsonian Museum today. And he's credited with saving countless American lives. And we're going to move over to the 101st Airborne. This is one man's uniform and his medals. And the clicker here is very interesting. You've probably seen it on television in the war movies, where the Airborne carried those and they clicked it, and another GI would answer with another clicker, confusing the enemy and identifying themselves as being on the same side. If you've seen the movie, the Band of Brothers, which was the 82nd Airborne, this is a complete airborne soldier with all of his equipment. Also, his spare parachute is here. They all carry 2 parachutes in case one did not open. Now we're going to move on here. We have British military. We have the Bren gun, and that's a gun that was stamped out from metal parts, and it was very heavily used by the British and a very good weapon. This water-cooled this water-cooled machine gun, 30 caliber Browning, was used all through the Second World War, all the way up through Korea. And then, like I say, this is water-cooled. Here we have Italian. We don't have much on them, but we do have enough to put up a display. And we get into the Japanese. And these 2 tunics are quite rare to find them in the condition they're in. There's a bomber. And I want to point out this surgeon's kit down here. This is a very valuable and very, very rare item. Moving on. This is the Japanese pistol, Enamel. And it was not a very good pistol at all. The flag back here is one of those that was carried. Have you seen the movies of the Japanese attacking? There was always a man out front holding his gun way up high with a small flag attached to it. And in this particular one, the whole squad signed it, and we do believe that that's blood stains on it. This is a 1,000-stitch apron. And this was, soldiers stood on the street corners in Japan, and everybody that went by, they asked them to sign a stitch. And when they had 1,000 stitches, they were invincible. This is a Japanese prayer flag, very rare item. I've never seen another one. The Samurai's up on top, one on the bottom, and the saber on the bottom would be a high-ranking Japanese officer. There's all kinds of small stuff here, and it's all original. There's hardly any reproductions in this collection. Germany we have a lot of, because GIs bought this stuff home, and then nobody knew what to do with it, and it winds up here, which is great. We love it. We enjoy having all of this. SS flag, Nazi banner. There's a German Luger, several different types of German pistols, and many Japanese flags all over the, and German flags, they're everywhere. Again, there's the Sturmgewehr, the automatic pistol, which was used extensively by the Germans. Uniforms. And I'm going to step around the corner. Oh, can't leave this out. This is the Army Air Corps. The United States did not have an Air Force until 1947 as a separate unit. This is the father of our curator, Ed Casey. And we like to keep him on display because he's important. Here we have an 81 millimeter mortar. Now this shell is dropped down the barrel. It fires out on a very high arch, and it could be used up to 4 miles. Okay, German Wehrmacht soldier, which would be just a regular foot soldier, or a grunt as we call them. This is a German pilot, would be in North Africa, because of, you can tell by the color of the uniform. SP-22 switchboard, that was a field switchboard. This is a Japanese soldier, and I want to point out how short he was. They were all very short people at the time. They carried very little equipment with them compared to the United States soldiers. We had everything, backpacks and everything. They had a little shoulder bag, their samurai sword, a little bit of rice, and their weapon, and they were ready to go to war. This is a pilot. He would a German pilot. He would have fought in Europe, and you can see the difference in the weight of the uniforms. This is to keep them warm, that one to keep them cool. Here we have a 75 millimeter recoilless rifle. This is the same caliber as the cannon you saw on the opposite side. And we're back to the Air Corps. Like I say, we did not have an Air Force until 1947. And these are the insulated boots. They're electric for heat because it gets very cold up in those bombers. We have a wonderful collection of headgear, and it's all pristine. It's like brand new. I know another Navy leather jacket. I believe that's Navy. There's a helmet with a big dent in it, and we were told that the guy that wore that helmet had a headache for the rest of his life. And we're getting into the Navy now. And you're all familiar with this photograph. Okay, and this is, there's a Navy officer's sword there, and those line of battleships, I'm not sure which ones they are. And we get over to here, we have a 3-inch deck gun off of an American gunboat. I don't know much about it, but it was given to us. This is a 30 caliber air-cooled machine gun. If you compare it to the water-cooled one that we've seen earlier, there's a big difference. That was a 5-man crew. This was a 2-man crew.
This is the Korean era. This is actually one of the helmets, 2 of the helmets they actually used in the Korean War. One's Navy, one's Air Force. Shows you the types of helmets they had, the headgear they wore, and the enemy headgear is over here. This is actually a poncho used during the Korean War. It shows you all the different things the Rangers unit, Connecticut unit that served. In here is the bunker communications. And what they would do is they would call up on the radio here, the landline from the front lines. They needed support. They would call on the basic radio for artillery or tanks or whatever they needed. He's always had 2 guys in the rack sleeping with 1 guy on duty. 24-hour shifts. Over here, this is what a basic infantryman will look like. The can opener around his neck, usually for the sea rations he has to use. Usually carries a spoon in his pocket all the time. In the front here, the bunker, it shows you a 30 caliber machine gun and a couple more uniforms, the type they wore during the Vietnam era. Now over here we have a wing of a Japanese Zero. It was actually shot down by a unit, Connecticut unit. It shows a picture of it over here from the islands, how they kept track of all the ones they shot down, damaged, and destroyed, and all the locations they were in, and all the medals they received. This here is a kamikaze, the type of uniforms they wore. Okay. Over this way here, we have the Vietnam era. This shows you all the main units during the Vietnam era. This would show you that this is a warrant officer's uniform for the helicopter pilots. Inside this display here, we have a vest that's used by the helicopter gunners with the helmet. So they'll communicate with their pilot. And a lot of memorabilia about Vietnam. It shows you the M14 rifles over here we were all trained on, and most of us when we were overseas received an M16 rifle, which is called light infantry. When you see anybody with no vest on, that's light infantry. Most here people jump out of helicopters and do assaults and things like that, and search and destroys. Over here shows you what a fire base looks like when you call to support main batteries or something like that. It'd be a 105s and tanks with 155 guns on them. On top, you'll see the APCs. A lot of their APCs that had problem with those is the RPGs in the back would knock them out. We also have an SKS assault rifle there, an AK-47 mounted on an NVA there. It shows you what type of weapons they carried. There were thousands of different types used. Down here shows you some of the swords and bayonets and things like that they used. Up on top, you'll see the uniforms, the different variations we had. The center one there is the first when we first got to Vietnam. Then we had the green pattern, and we had the camouflage over here is the Vietnamese pattern. Over there is the third pattern over there they tried out with. Basic dress uniform is the one on the end over here. Now in this cabinet here shows you what they call the Brown Water Navy. Now the Brown Water Navy were the gunboats that went up and down the rivers of the Mekong. And they went pretty far up. And if the infantry needed support, the guns on these boats would give you the support you needed. Below that, you'll see what they call the Viet Cong punji pit or punji trap. Many of these things are buried so you couldn't see them, and you fell into them and you get infected and the poison on them. This side over here, this is actually uniform in West Point. This is one of their marching uniforms. This one here is in the Pennsylvania Military School. Unfortunately, this family, he's still missing in action in World War II. Gilbert family presented us to it. They have yet to find him. We also have 2 Medal of Honor winners here. We have William Soderman, who's an bazooka man during World War II. Actually stopped a bunch of tanks so his troops can fall back. And we have Bob Nate, who fought in the Pacific, stopped a bunch of Japanese, and kept his men alive. Good enough?